The weapon triangle is perhaps one of Fire Emblem's most iconic mechanics, but its ideas and concepts go far beyond just being a gameplay feature. Here, I make the case that the weapon triangle is in fact heavily integrated into the story and themes in nearly all Fire Emblem games, by leveraging its gameplay functions to provide valuable framing and context for characters and factions. The weapon triangle is a rock-paper-scissors style system of advantages and disadvantages between the three main weapon types of Fire Emblem, where swords beat axes, axes beat lances, and lances beat swords. One of the main benefits of this mechanic is that it helps differentiate weapons that would otherwise be similar and gives you a reason to use different weapons in different circumstances. The weapon triangle's simplicity, influence, and presence in so many games makes it basically synonymous with Fire Emblem, making it perhaps one of its most defining mechanics. The way that the weapon triangle works is that by using a weapon that has a favorable matchup to your opponents, such as a sword against an axe, you'll be rewarded with a small bonus of hit rate and damage, while a disadvantage will apply a penalty of a similar amount. The weapon triangle typically refers to physical weapons, but many games also include separate weapon triangles for other weapon types. Typically, the actual gameplay benefit of adhering to the weapon triangle is not particularly significant, especially in earlier games, but some titles make it matter a lot more by having special interactions with other mechanics such as weapon rank bonuses. So let's break down some specific differences between the various Fire Emblem games that featured the weapon triangle. The weapon triangle was first introduced in Fire Emblem 4 Genealogy of the Holy War and was present in every succeeding Fire Emblem title until Shadows of Valentia and Three Houses, which lacked a true weapon triangle mechanic. Earlier titles from Fire Emblem 4 until Radiant Dawn also included a separate triangle involving magic, but it was not nearly as impactful because of the relative scarcity of magic uses for both the player and the enemy. This magic weapon triangle will later be removed starting from Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, and from there on, the system will be significantly changed by applying a bonus or penalty based on weapon rank, as well as nullifying other weapon rank bonuses for the disadvantaged party. Fire Emblem Fates specifically would add a unique twist to the weapon triangle mechanic by adding tomes, bows, and throw weapons, which are shurikens and knives, directly into the standard weapon triangle, making nearly all weapon types interact with its mechanics. The weapon triangle was not implemented in Fire Emblem Shadows of Valentia, and in fact, there are no playable characters in that game that can use axes. And there's also no weapon triangle mechanic in Three Houses, though there are breaker skills that can give you advantages against certain weapon types. But to access that bonus, all you need to do is equip that skill, and it is not affected by the weapon that you have equipped. And strangely, Fire Emblem 10 Radiant Dawn had the baffling decision to remove the weapon triangle, but only on hard mode, leaving it present in all the lower difficulties. But despite these small gaps in implementation, the weapon triangle was brought back in Fire Emblem Engage, but reimagined, where in lieu of providing stat bonuses, weapon triangle advantage allows you to break an opponent, preventing counterattacks for the current and next combat. It also adds a separate advantage of arts, which are fist weapons, against daggers, bows, and tomes, which doesn't end up mattering very much because arts aren't very good. The magnitude of the hit rate and might bonus or penalty varies a lot in between the games, but typically varies in between 5 to 20 hit and anywhere from 0 to 2 might. Though, because of the true hit mechanic, the actual impact on your true hit rate can end up being a lot more dramatic. Typically, from Fire Emblem 4 through 10, the weapon triangle matters a lot at the start of the game but decreases in relevance as you go on, when your stats increase to the point where 15 hit here or there doesn't matter nearly as much. But this changed starting from Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, which added considerable weapon rank bonuses for having high ranks in certain weapon types. These bonuses are always active except in the case where you have weapon triangle disadvantage, which can cause a significant change to the hit rate and damage done. For an extreme example, let's say you have S rank swords in Fire Emblem Fates, which grants a passive +4 might and +5 hit when using swords. When you fight an axe user, you get +20 hit and +2 might from the weapon triangle advantage. But against a lance user, not only do you have -20 hit and -2 might from weapon triangle disadvantage, you also lose your weapon rank bonuses, causing you to have an additional -5 hit and -4 might, resulting in a total penalty of -25 hit and -6 might. And so the difference from going from weapon triangle advantage to disadvantage can be as big as 45 hit and 8 might, which is tremendous, no matter what stage of the game you're in. Fire Emblem Engage's weapon triangle takes a form of break, which does not provide additional damage on its own unless you have a specific skill to do so. And its main benefit changes, because if you attack with weapon triangle advantage and do damage, You will not receive counterattacks for this at the next combat, allowing you to do chip damage, though notably aura units will ignore this mechanic. Interacting well with the break mechanic allows you to do a lot of damage while taking little in return, but it's a lot more conditional than you might think, because it is contingent on getting the hit and dealing the damage, meaning that if you miss, you will not break the enemy, and if you deal no damage, you will also not break the enemy. Enemy bosses on maddening difficulty have a skill that prevents them from being broken, meaning that you cannot leverage weapon triangle advantage against bosses. And so because of these factors, break becomes a lot less relevant in the endgame as you focus more on one-rounding enemies. And so by talking about all the mechanics, I hope I've established that the weapon triangle can be a significant contributor to combat success. The degree to which it matters depends a lot on what stage of the game you're in and which game you're playing. Adhering to it is very easy, and it adds a valuable layer of mechanical depth to the game by giving you reasons to care about it. And it is for this reason that having weapon triangle control or access to many different types of weapons is such a sought after attribute in many Fire Emblem games. But the weapon triangle adds a lot more than just mechanical depth to the game. It also contributes greatly to the information density of the game's user interface. It is very important that you're able to correctly identify enemy characteristics based on what they look like. And this is useful because it lets you formulate strategies without needing to look at the individual stats of every individual enemy. For example, if you see a Pegasus Knight, you'll know that they fly so they can ignore terrain and that bows are effective against them. If you see an armorer, you know that they're slow and have high defense, meaning that magic is probably a good bet. If you see cavalry, you'll know that your cavalry effective weapons will work well against them and you need to be careful about their movement range. And one of the main defining features of a unit's sprite or model, aside from their base unit type, is the weapon that they hold. And as you can see in the GBA era, it's anywhere from a fourth to one half of the entire sprite. So most of the time, you should be able to immediately identify whether or not you have weapon triangle advantage against the enemies that you're seeing, allowing you to immediately convert the information into an incremental advantage. Sometimes this gets a bit ambiguous, especially with enemies that can wield multiple weapon types, but most of the time it's good enough to get you started. And having this information is incredibly useful because it acts as a sort of mini guide within the game, allowing you to infer possible good lines of action without handholding you and telling you exactly what to do. In a game where there are dozens of characters to take into account every turn, accounting over everything can be quite overwhelming. And this is something I think that Fire Emblem does quite well, especially in comparison to other strategy RPGs, by having an information-dense, readable interface that can allow you to generalize your opponent's capabilities in some vague but roughly accurate manner. And so the weapon triangle serves as a form of immediately recognizable strength and weakness. If you see an enemy axe unit, you know that your sword unit will probably do well against them. And if they have a lance, you'll know you can probably have your axe user fight them instead. And so by doing this, you can leverage a tactical advantage by fighting where you're strong and avoiding situations where you're weak. So this applies mainly to gameplay, but because it resonates so well in gameplay, it can also be effectively used in the story as well. The weapon triangle can be used to show that a character is strong in combat in the game, but it can also be used to show that they're strong in combat in the story. And this works even without cutscenes or choreography, which is important, especially in earlier games when the technology wasn't advanced enough to have full motion cutscenes with choreographed combat, so cutscenes were often done by using game events instead. For example, in the prologue of FE8, when Volter attacks Seth, he uses a lance which has an advantage against Seth's sword, demonstrating Volter's superiority in this fight. The weapon triangle doesn't always play into cutscenes like this, but it's very rare for a character with weapon triangle disadvantage to win the fight. And when Fire Emblem started having animated cutscenes, this philosophy seems to have carried over. For the first truly animated combat cutscene in the Fire Emblem series, in Fire Emblem 9 Path of Radiance, Grail fights a Black Knight, where he is visually given the option to choose between a sword and an axe, but he chooses the axe, demonstrating his folly and overconfidence. And as a direct result of this, he misses 4 attacks in a row and then dies in one hit. You might think this is a joke, but I think this is intentional, because in nearly every animated fight cutscene going forward, the person with weapon triangle advantage wins the fight. In Fire Emblem Echo, Shadows of Valencia, which doesn't actually have the weapon triangle, but this rule still holds. When Celica has a vision of Alm fighting Rudolph, Alm wields a sword while Rudolph wields a lance. And in the cutscene, Alm misses all of his attacks and deals no damage and then immediately dies, once again demonstrating Rudolph's superiority in this fight through the use of weapon triangle advantage. In one of the opening cutscenes of Fire Emblem Engage, Alir, who wields a sword, fights a corrupted who wields an axe, and despite a comical number of misses on both sides, and the corrupted putting up a very good fight, Alir wins because of weapon triangle advantage. This corrupted could have had any weapon, but having the axe was obviously an intentional choice, and we can also see this in Fire Emblem Awakening, where Chrom, wielding a sword, fights a Risen, who wields an axe, and I think the victor of this battle should be pretty obvious at this point. There's also another fight cutscene in Fire Emblem Awakening where axe-wielding Risen fight lance-wielding soldiers. In this case, the Risen are winning, and it's only later when Lucina, a sword unit, arrives that any of the Risen are slain. There are only two counterexamples I can think of, and the first is one cutscene in Radiant Dawn where enemy soldiers lose a fight despite having weapon triangle advantage against two sword users, the first being Ike and the second being Mia. And I can think of a couple of rationalizations to help support my theory, such as the fact that soldiers are really bad stat-wise, and so even weapon triangle advantage can't save them. Or perhaps it's a reference to how Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn's hard mode does not have weapon triangle advantage or disadvantage, which is reflected in this cutscene. But this cutscene also shows every member of the Guild mercenaries doing their part. Clearly there are other ideas that this scene wants to convey. There's also a couple of brief instances in the Fire Emblem Engage opening where Alear swats away a couple of lance-wielding corrupted, and some of the lords and emblems use swords against lance-wielding corrupted. But this isn't really so much a fight as a one-sided beatdown, and I kinda struggle to remember that this was a fight cutscene to begin with. Regardless, I think there's a clear case to make that weapon triangle advantage is used in cutscenes to establish that a particular character has the advantage in a fight, and I think it's very much intentional. And I think this intention is rooted in the core narrative structure of most Fire Emblem titles. Most Fire Emblem games draw heavily from previous titles, and so have similar story themes and structures. The main character can almost always be described as a heroic underdog exiled prince with a magical sword, and many enemy types also fall into categorizations. I'm speaking very generally, but typically speaking, most Fire Emblem games feature bandits, an empire against which you are rebelling, and a cult that's secretly pulling the strings behind the scenes. And each of these enemy categories tend to support some of the defining features of the main character. For instance, the bandits are disorganized criminals, and they're there so the main character can defeat them to establish that they are a good person. The empire is often portrayed as being strong, which is used to demonstrate that the player character is an underdog. And the evil dragon cult that typically haunts the late game tend to be vulnerable to various gimmicks, such as the dragon defeating magical sword that the main character often has. So let's go through a couple of examples, starting with Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, the first game of the series, and the progenitor of many story tropes that continue to be used to this day. The first real map of the game is literally against a whole bunch of pirates that invade Talus, and bandits continue to be a common enemy type in the early game. In the mid-game, you tend to fight many organized militaries of nations that are in service to the Dora Empire. For the final stretch of the game, you fight Garnet, who is secretly pulling the strings behind everything in the game. In Fire Emblem 4, Genealogy of the Holy War, you start by fighting Verdane, which is essentially a whole bandit country, and later you fight several empires or supposed empires, the main one being the Granville Empire in the second generation, secretly being controlled by the Loptier cult, which is the cult. In Fire Emblem 5, Thracia 776, there are pirates and bandits, the empire is represented by Thracia and Frege, and the cult is, well, the Loptier cult. Fire Emblem 8, Sacred Stones pits you against bandits, the Great Empire, and Lion, who is the secret wizard behind the scenes. Fire Emblem 9 and 10 have the usual bandits. The Empire is Dayan and later Banyan, though the secret wizard controlling things behind the scenes is Sephren, who's not really revealed until the second game. Fire Emblem Awakening also has similar enemy types, with the first arc centering King Gangro of Plegia, who's basically a big bandit boss, the second arc centering around Valm, which is an empire, and the third arc, which is about the cult, which is Grima, Valadar, and the Risen. And this happens again in Fire Emblem Engage, where the bandits are bandits, the empire is Lugia, and the cult are the Four Hounds and Sombron. Fire Emblem Fates kind of deviates because of its multi-route structure, but you still fight bandits, you still fight an empire, which is mostly Nor, sometimes Hoshido, and the underground cult controlling everything behind the scenes is Vala, which is literally underground. And Fire Emblem Three Houses also deviates because of this multi-route structure, mainly because you don't see everything in just one route. You start the game off by fighting bandits as usual, and in most routes you end up fighting the Adrestian Empire. And as usual for our cult, we have the Argarthans, who live underground in a subterranean dubstep city. So I think I've established that most games have similar enemy categorizations, and I think each faction can be characterized by various Fire Emblem weapons, and the dynamics between these factions can be represented by using the weapon triangle. And in this case, I will describe the sword as being the main character's or the hero's weapon, the axes are the bandit's weapon, the lances are the empire's weapon, and tomes are often the cult's weapon. It is rather apparent that Fire Emblem main characters overwhelmingly wield swords, and even in games where a lord does not use a sword, they are often accompanied by others that do, mainly because, well, the sword is heavily represented in European mythology and folklore as a hero's weapon, so to speak. And Fire Emblem, as a series mainly based on medieval Europe, would naturally be inclined to give main characters magical swords. It is also immediately apparent that nearly every bandit enemy you fight overwhelmingly uses axes. The axe-wielding criminal class is extremely common in Fire Emblem, with a tremendous number of small variations across the entire series. And I think that the main reason that they use axes is to make it so that you, the player who uses swords, has the advantage over them, making them a justifiable enemy for easy and early fights. And then we have the Empire, which is typically an organized military. And organized militaries in antiquity overwhelmingly use spears and lances as a primary armament. And we can see this with the Soldier class, which is traditionally an enemy-only class that can only wield lances. Even though in practice, soldiers are weak as hell, they have lances, which is meant to indicate that the Empire has some sort of advantage over you and that you are the underdog. In that same sense, an organized military is probably less equipped to pursue random bandits, which is contrasted with the main character's roving band of teenagers with attitude, which is represented by the lances having a disadvantage against axes. And finally, we have the Cult, which is typically led by a dark wizard, who most of the time wields a dark magic tome. And I think their clandestine and hidden nature is representative of how they're outside the weapon triangle. And so, we can see that the weapon triangle is very often used to frame the story and frame how you, the player, interacts with the enemies that you fight. The player's swords have an advantage over the bandit's axes, making them a good candidate for early game introductory battles. And because you're not meant to feel like you should be struggling against them, the move that the game tries to go for when you're fighting an Imperial force is that you are an underdog and you have a disadvantage, hence the weapon triangle disadvantage of lances over swords. Often for the final stretch of the game, you fight the secret power behind it all, the Cult, which uses tomes or other non-triangle weapons. And I think the point of this is to show that the player has grown and even the odds, you're no longer at a weapon triangle disadvantage. By the end of the game, you're often not the underdog, and your in-story combat advantages are more well represented by things like effective weapons, like your dragon-slaying Holy Blade. In conclusion, the weapon triangle has various mechanical benefits for the game, ranging from relatively insignificant to being substantial in others. But regardless of the particular statistical benefits, it also gives you immediately usable information about good matchups and what lines of play are useful. And I think either intentionally or unintentionally, I lean more towards intentionally, the weapon triangle draws a line through the core narrative structure of Fire Emblem. And it does well to set the tone for the player's progression, the journey through the story, and their interaction with various enemy factions. And it does this through an excellent form of gameplay story interaction, where strength and advantage in the gameplay is analogous to strength and advantage in the story. Anyway, that's about it. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one. Please subscribe.